Welcome to our final panel of the day. My name is Petra McGillen. I'm a member of the Department of German Studies, and it will be my pleasure to be your moderator this afternoon. And the topic of our panel is film criticism of the 1990s, a period that was transformative for the profession in many ways. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about the many transformations that happened during that time. Before we begin, let me remind you of the key points of our format, even though at this point you've probably internalized it all, but as Germans like to say, doppelt hält besser. So speakers, please limit your remarks to 12 to 15 minutes. As you approach the 12-minute mark, I'll hold up a card saying 2 more minutes. And that's right, we'll start playing music. No. The card will show you that you have another 2 minutes to wrap up, and I'll look increasingly intensely at you if you don't. Okay, and audience, in the interest of hearing many different voices and different points of view, please keep your questions to the point as well. Okay, now let me introduce our speakers, and I thought I'd introduce all of you at once to avoid interruptions later, and then we can plunge right in. Okay, our first speaker will be Eric Rentschler, and he is the Arthur Kingsley Porter Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures at Harvard. His research focuses on German cinema from the Weimar Republic to the post-war era. He has published numerous influential monographs on film history, theory, and criticism. Most recently, The Use and Abuse of Cinema, German Legacies from the Weimar Era to the Present, which came out with Columbia University Press in 2015. And today, he will speak about German film criticism of the 1990s. Cristina Nord is in a leading position at the Goethe Institute, where she directs the cultural programming, or the Kulturprogramm, for Southwest Europe. So it's a fairly comprehensive area, including Belgium, France, Luxembourg, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. Before she joined the Goethe Institute in 2015, she had a career in journalism. So she was a practicing film critic. I don't know whether she still is. And she worked as leading film editor and critic for the Berlin-based newspaper Die Tageszeitung. From what I heard, her decision to leave the field was tough, and I'm curious as to what ultimately motivated her. Appropriately, Cristina Nord will speak about changes in the profession and the medium. Dana Stevens is the movie critic of the daily web magazine Slate, and before she became the magazine's movie critic, she wrote the Slate television and pop culture column Surfer Girl for 2 years. She has also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post Book World, Book Forum, and The Atlantic. She has a PhD in comparative literature from UC Berkeley, which she wrote, as I just learned, on Portuguese poetry. And I really want to know how that maps onto her current job. Together with Stephen Metcalf and Julia Turner, she does the well-known Culture Gabfest podcast, a form of conversational film criticism that I can highly recommend. And Dana Stevens will talk about the rise of online film criticism in its current state. And our final speaker will be Fatima Naqvi, and she is a professor and graduate director in the Department of Germanic, Russian, and East European Languages and Literatures at Rutgers. And she is one of our own. She has a BA from Dartmouth, 1993, and her research covers both filmic and literary traditions. For example, in 2007, Fatima published a monograph on the literary and cultural rhetoric of victimhood in modern Western Europe, and she recently also authored a book about the films of Michael Haneke. Her current book project focuses on the role of visual culture in the work of Thomas Bernhard. Fatima Naqvi will speak about the distinction of Filmwissenschaft versus Filmkritik. Okay, so I'd say let us get right into medias res, and Rick, you have the word.
Thanks so much, Garrett and Noah, for making this forum possible. I'm deadly pleased to be among such illustrious company. Let me get down to it, see what I can do in 15 minutes. What does the writing of film history have to do with film criticism? I guess as I write a history of film during the coal era, and that's not the age of cholera, but you know there might be something in common insofar as what I'm doing is in a way a pathology, or at least writing about a pathology. I guess one asks oneself, you know, what do films of a period have to say, and what do people writing during that period have to say about films, which is to ask what kinds of discourses are at work in films, and what forces, what determinants shape these discourses, and under what conditions. And if you talk about film criticism, you're also eager to understand the discourses that circulate about films, and you then ask yourself the conditions under which one speaks about film and one writes about film. Well, I want to say, I think if I'm going to talk about film criticism in the 90s today, because it is very important in my work in trying to make sense of these films. I mean, obviously, you're not just talking about films when you're a film historian, you're talking about cinema, and you're talking about the various institutions that govern cinema and the social spaces that cinema inhabits. Well, we have, I think, at this point, a lot more work at hand that help us understand the larger contours of the history of German film criticism. We have, of course, this book that came out by David Steinitz 2 years ago, The History of German Film Criticism. We have 20 monographs now in the Film and Schrift series devoted to individual critics, from Hans Siemsen and Herbert Jähring to most recently Wilfried Berghahn, wonderful volume. Well, I'd like to sort of tell you a mini history and then lead into the 90s. I mean, let's go back to Krakauer. Krakauer's notion of film as a form of social criticism, that the film critic of any kind of distinction has to, above all, be a social critic. T.W. Dorner would later reflect on Krakauer and say that he would be the one who would develop a relationship to films as social facts, that he would bring sociology to the cinema and decode films as ideology. And he would be the one who would make the professional film criticism in Germany intellectually viable by reading film as a cipher for social tendencies, for thought control, and ideological other direction. And clearly, Krakauer would be essential in the shaping of film criticism in post-war West Germany. He would become the role model for the editors of Filmkritik in the 50s. And his impetus, I think, would have a decisive impact on writing about cinema in Germany through the 70s and up to the 80s, into the 80s somewhat, particularly for people writing in the Frankfurter Rundschau, but not just there. I think there is, if you follow this history, there's this moment in the late 80s where a decisive shift of emphasis has become apparent. You've already seen fault lines in the kind of rift between the on the editorial board of Filmkritik in the late 60s. But by the late 80s, there's a real shift of paradigms at work here. It's curiously, perhaps not coincidentally, coterminous with the demise of New German cinema and the Autoren film, as well as the coming of cable television and the fall of the wall. What happens is, and it's going to be dramatized in the film we're showing tonight, you're going to see a new generation of critics arise and how they become visible on a variety of fronts, and how a different ethos among film critics becomes evident. I think when we talk about film criticism in the 80s in Germany, we really have to think about not just, let us say, what's going on in the editorial boards of newspapers and the kind of business of selling newspapers, but rather fundamental shifts in the public sphere. Alexander Kluge already talks about this at length, but with a number of co-writers in the collection Taking of Stock on Film. The Utopia of Film, Bestandsaufnahme, came out in 1983. And he's talking about the, what happens to film, what happens to film culture when all of a sudden you have cable networks, when media consortia become more powerful, when electronic software, when cable networks, when satellite television, all of these things come into being and help shape and, as a matter of fact, fundamentally shift the way in which people define their leisure time. So that for him, these industrial forces recast perceptions of space and time and shatter the senses in a constant barrage of prefabricated programming and pattern meaning, Obviously, this has a great impact on film culture, but according to Kluge as well, it has a strong impact on not just the making of films, but the partaking of them. Well, if you look at the history of German film criticism, in West German film criticism, there's a really striking change of generations that takes place. I mean, Hans Christoph Blumenberg, who was a really preeminent critic for Die Zeit, moves to become a filmmaker in the early 80s. Peter Buka, another preeminent film critic for the Süddeutsche Zeitung, passes away in 1989. Wolfram Schutte tires of film criticism and moves to literary criticism. And then people like Gertrude Koch and Carson Witter, very prominent figures, get academic appointments. And you have this generation of very fashionable, stylish, almost dandyish, maybe not just almost, dandyish young figures who somehow come onto the scene. Peter Kurte, Andreas Kilb, who becomes the head critic at Die Zeit and later at FAZ. You have the journals, Filme and Steadicam. You have people like Harold Pali, Wolfgang Herbel, Michel Altain, Claudius Seidel. More about him later. I mean, Altain, I think, and you'll see that in tonight's film, he becomes the most prominent figure in this constellation. In the film tonight, he'll talk about how he grew up in Germany but never felt at home with German cinema. And as part of his generation, there was a way in which one found American cinema particularly cool, that one worshipped auteurism but not German auteurs. And I think when we talk about this generation, it's very much a decidedly male one, very decidedly one that was made in Munich. In a way, they look back to the so-called Sensibilisten of the late 60s, people who were more interested in describing their feelings about films rather than making sense of things. I think the ethos here, to a great degree, sort of took its cue from Susan Sontag's essay Against Interpretation, which was very important in Germany already in the 60s. I think the real key figure for this generation was Frida Graffe as a role model, although it kind of dumbed down Frida Graffe. They didn't somehow, let us say, they weren't intellectual in the way she was. They wanted to write as well as she could, but they surely were not, let us say, friends of Barthes and French post-structuralism in the way that Frida Graffe was, in really interesting, compelling, and complex ways. I think another key figure for the sensibilists was again, a misunderstood Krakauer of theory of film. Theory of film becomes a primer for cinephilia, you know, and the notion is you go to the movies not to think, but to feel. You want to escape any kind of ideological cubby holes. You just want to experience the world in all of its richness. So that what this new generation really becomes is a form of kind of postmodern existentialists who cultivate a form of poetic empiricism. Sinnlichkeit statt Sinn in German. Now, there's a moment where, in the late 80s, where there's this incredible showdown. There's a series of lectures at the Free University in Berlin on film criticism. It was later collected, the lectures were later corrected in a volume called The Power of Film Criticism. Claudia Lenzen gave a lecture in that series. I remember it well. So Witte and his critics, former critics at the Frankfurter Rundschau, Gertrude Koch and Wolfram Schutte especially, were attacked by Claudius Seidel as critical critics. That is to say, ideologues, symptomatic readers. You know, these are the products of Frankfurt and its legacy of critical theory, of Krakauer, Adorno, and Habermas, of the very acute dialectical sensitivity that grew out of Manhattan minds, uneasy coexistence of international capital, allied occupation, and alternative culture. Our critical critics, students of the Frankfurt School, Seidel said, and their brothers and sisters in arms, are always demanding the same thing, enlightenment. They demand enlightenment from films, and the goal of their criticism must necessarily also be enlightenment. And for Seidel, the critical critic didn't trust his or her eyes. They, in a sense, consulted books and let books, in a sense, be their filter. That, in a sense, for Seidel, the problem was that people didn't bother to ask what the film actually does. It was always this constant search for meaning. In actual fact, said Seidel, the critical critic is an expert on realities of all sorts, and only in that way an expert on film. Well, in this debate, I would say Seidel did not come out very well. He got creamed, actually. And Witte's response, I think, was very compelling, I mean, and utterly devastating. I mean, he said, what Seidel and his cohorts are really are smug ego agents. They're subjectivists whose fondest assets are a marketable style, a fashionable anti-intellectualism, and a rarefied visual connoisseurship. We're getting back to this variance, and this is a German variation on the variance between, you know, popular personal writing and sociological criticism. For Witter, the problem was what these critics were trying to do is make themselves the center of attention. That there was something actually even infantile about, or narcissistically infantile about what they were doing. That their solipsism doesn't allow them to be open to a large possibility of films, that they have a very limited, circumscribed understanding of what films can do and what films deserve attention. Now, the way in which film history has, the way in which Stein has codified this variance then is what he calls, on the one hand, the new subjectivism, and the other, the critical criticism. And I would say this series of lectures was the kind of last hurrah for critical criticism in some ways, one might say, at least according to Steinitz. There's a way in which this young generation came on to overtake the scene. I think you're going to see Michael Caine becomes the crowning figure in this new generation. Tonight's film is very much an act of hagiography in that regard. It's a film very much, I think, with a certain polemical agenda in the midst of this act of mourning. Just in closing here, I mean, I'm not happy with this simple binary here. I think it's rather schematic. I think there are a couple other questions I'd like to close with. If you tell the narrative this way, and you break it down to this binary, it's a very masculine one, masculinist one. It leaves out crucial voices like, say, Christina Nord or Claudia Lenzen or Miriam Niramud or Katja Nicodemus, leaves out journals like Frauen und Film. It's also a decidedly West-ocentric perspective. It doesn't credit journals from the former GDR or writers like Ralph Schenk. I think beyond that, one would want to factor in, let us say, the wide array of film journals that were at work doing very interesting things in the 90s in Germany, not just the old standards APD, Film and Filmdienst, but also Filmwärts, Nachblende, 24, Schnitt, Filmblatt, Gnet Mau, or, and as of 1995, of course, Revolver. Now, finally, I would like to just say, if you look at film critics from the 20s, like Krakauer, like Josef Roth, I mean, one of the things that's striking is the incredible range that they had, all the kinds of different things they could write about, and not just film. Film was just one part of modernity, one part of a mass culture. And I guess one of the questions one could ask, and I think is an important one in general for this conference, is why were film critics in Germany during the 90s, at this time of sort of converging media and media explosion, why were so few of them writing about the media in general as well? Why were so few of them open to larger audiovisual possibility? I mean, I can think of maybe Georg Sessling or Klaus Kreimeier, but there's a very, very limited number of people along those lines. And I will close here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick Rentschler, and thank you for bearing with my janitorial attitude. Okay. And our next speaker is Cristina Nord.
Excuse me, could I move this a little bit? Because if not, I think was lost. No, it's okay. I think it's fine. Okay, thank you very much, Noah and Gerd, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be among all of you. And however, I have to start by saying that when I was when Gerd got in touch with me and invited me to this conference, I was like, well, I'm no longer a film critic, actually, because in October 2015, I quit my job at Die Tageszeitung, where I was the head film critic for 15 years, and started with the Goethe-Institut. And Petra already explained that I'm in charge of the cultural programming in a region called Southwestern Europe, which is an administrative term because the center of Southwestern Europe is, strangely enough, in Brussels, where I'm based, actually. Yeah, so I was thinking about what could be my contribution to this conference, and we discussed it a little, and we agreed upon that I could talk a little bit about my experience at Die Tageszeitung, which is not exactly the 90s. I started to write as a freelancer in the 90s, but as a head film critic of the Tageszeitung, I started in 2002. So I can't really talk about the 90s. However, I had something in mind, and Eric already mentioned it, because I wanted to talk a little bit about Carson Witter, who has been prominent in your presentation. And I also wanted to talk about the polemic and the conference and the debate, the very harsh debate between Seidel and Witter. But as this has already been done, I'm going to skip that part and try to focus on what was of particular interest for me in Witter's work, which is something which has not been mentioned. In the talks we heard today, there was nostalgia was mentioned from time to time. I don't perceive of myself as a nostalgic person. I'm also like to have sort of like a perspective into the future. However, I think as I'm talking about an activity I did until recently, there will be one or two nostalgic moments because, yeah, let's see. Let me try to explain why I wanted to mention Carson Witter and his work. Carson Witter died in 1995. He was quite young then. He was born in 1944. It was a very premature death. And he was, as you mentioned, writing for Frankfurter Rundschau, not as a staff member, but as a freelancer. He was also working for Die Zeit. And he was involved in film studies at the Freie Universität Berlin before it even really properly existed. It was department of it was part of the theater department back then. And the reasons why Carson Witter is important for me are manifold. One is that he was a very key figure in that debate, which was crucial in the late 80s, early 90s. And you mentioned the generational shift that took place. And in a way, I think I like to think of myself and of my role as the film critic at Taz as being sort of like another generation. Sort of like there was the Carsten Witter, Gertrud Koch generation, and then there came the Kilbs and Seidels and Alteens, and then there came newer faces, and I think in a way I was one of them, at least I hope so. I think what I found very interesting in Carsten Witter's work is that he has an approach to films that are not from Europe and that are not from the US. That was something crucial for my work too. And that's not just like because Africa has to be represented in the discussion of film. It's not sort of like only about representation. It's also about knowledge production and about the fact that a lot of knowledge is produced, but there are a lot of blind spots, and I found it always very important to enlighten these blind spots. And I think you also mentioned, and I'm going to get back for a moment to an essay you wrote on subtitles later, that talking about films that come from somewhere else, talking about a film from Senegal, helps you to overcome a certain narcissistic attitude, helps you to overcome navel-gazing. And I think contemporary societies are pretty full with navel-gazing, so it's good to have an antidote. And it's good when cinema can sort of like provide this antidote. I have to improvise a little, as I said. Yeah, okay. So when Witter turned to films from other places than Europe or Germany or the US, he had a very special attitude. And I would like to talk about that and giving the example of a very precise film, a Cuban film, Fresa y Chocolate. Strawberries and Chocolate, I think, was the international title. It premiered at the Berlinale in 1994, and it was released in Germany in fall 1994. And everybody was very, very happy about the film. It was the first Cuban film that addressed the subject matter of gay people, of homosexuality. It was a huge success. Everybody loved it. Taz, the Tageszeitung, the newspaper I later worked for, published a review written by a Cuban writer, Juan Diaz, if I recall it correctly. And he was raving because he, in a way, perceived the fact that this film was so successful as an anti-imperialistic statement, sort of like a film that would break the overwhelming power of Hollywood. And there was one critic in the concert of critics in Germany who did not agree, and that was Carson Witter. And why? I mean, he was sort of like very prone to films coming from what is nowadays called the Global South, but he didn't like Fresa y Chocolate. And he explained it in a very thorough manner in a review he published in Die Zeit. First of all, because he was missing a gay sensitivity in the film, and he could describe very elaborately why this characteristic gay sensitivity was missing. That was one point. And then, for instance, he mentioned Reinaldo Arenas, a Cuban writer who faced enormous troubles in Cuba because of his homosexuality and eventually left the country, moved to the US, died in 1990 in New York. He wrote a book, Antes que anochezca, before night falls. The book was turned into a film by Julian Schnabel later. Carson Witter, in writing about the film, he had the knowledge that Reinaldo Arenas existed, that he had written the book, that he was sort of like a very key figure when it came to understanding homosexuality in Cuba. He also mentioned other important Cuban writers like Severo Sadui and José Lezama Lima. So you could see that he knew really a lot about the situation, meaning that talking about a Cuban film, it's not only that you're like seeing something and then describing something and liking it because it's Cuban, because it's not from the US, because it's not from Germany, but really having the knowledge and the background information necessary to reveal important and relevant aspects of the film. And I find that highly interesting also in the light of what Dennis said about a certain film culture that produces what is called world cinema festival films from all over the world, clinging to a certain language, and us as recipients maybe not being able to really grasp things, to really understand things. Where are we when we're watching a film by Love Diaz? Love Diaz would not qualify in the categories you mentioned, like the typical festival film, the typical workshop-produced film. However, where are we when we see a film like that? And I think Carson Witter really tried to put himself in the position to be able to explain a lot of things about a film, a Cuban film, or if he was alive, maybe about a film by Love Diaz. And that brings me to something else which I find highly important and which was also important for my work at the newspaper, which is a little bit like the sociological impact, which oftentimes is dismissed as being blind for the aesthetic dimension of a film, or of being too content-oriented, or of being sort of like unable to grasp the specific beauty of cinema. And I would say that that is a very reductive reading of what Witter and Krakauer had in mind. And if you read the reviews Witter wrote, you can clearly see that he's very, very eager to discuss aesthetic decisions, that he's very able to do so too, and that he's also able to discuss aesthetic choices and sort of like linking them to special, to specific social circumstances. And I think that is something very important, that certain types of aesthetics appear not out of nowhere, but in a certain framework, in a certain context. And I think being a film critic, you should try to understand these kind of mechanisms, to understand these kind of developments, and you should try to be able to write about it. Now I strayed a little. And if you transfer this to the contemporary situation, I think it's really a demanding task. Because, for instance, if you talk about somebody like Apichatpong Veerasethaku, which I tried quite a lot, which I did at the newspaper several times, and you don't know anything about Thailand, and you don't know anything about the political dimension of the film, and then you interview him, and you suddenly realize that there are so many layers you don't see in the films. You're struck by their beauty. You're sort of like overwhelmed by their beauty, but there are so many things you don't see, and in a way I think you should be able to convey them, you should be able to see them, and you should be able to talk about them. Same goes for Love Diaz, and you should in a way be able to link Love Diaz to Lino Brocca, and think just the fact that, for instance, in Lino Brocca's films, you have these takes, and there are always like at least 10 people in one frame, which is something very unusual in Hollywood cinema, unless you have like 2,000 in one frame. So yeah, time is running out. Yeah, I mentioned briefly the essay by Ruby Ridge about subtitles and about the necessity to see foreign films, and that was something really important for me too. As I said, because it's sort of like something which prevents a tendency to navel gazing, and I think navel gazing in a way was what at least Claudio Seidel had in mind, but maybe he didn't have it in mind, but in a way it was what he did. Then there was this piece by Willy Winkler talking about, but okay, I'm straying, sorry. Yeah. So my key point is, what I really had in mind when I was working as a critic was to ask a little bit about what kind of imagination, what kind of fantasies are possible in a certain situation. And for instance, questions like, when you look at the films of the early films of the Berlin School, why is melancholy so important in these films? Why are people so melancholic? Why can't they take decisions? Why can't they move? Why are they stuck? What does it mean for us? Or another question, sort of like another topic. When you look at a film like Death Proof by Quentin Tarantino, what is the special take on exploitation film Tarantino has? And then in that framework, what is the special take of what kind of female pleasure is in these films? Is there the option for female pleasure, or is it sort of like X'd out? And what is Tarantino's specific turn on this? I find these questions highly interesting, and it was something I wanted to talk about in the newspaper. I'm going to finish in 1 second. When I started, early 2000s, I had the feeling that this was possible. The longer I was working for the newspaper, the less I had the feeling that it was welcome, and the less I had the feeling that it was easy to do, and the more I had the feeling that there were so many tasks, so many routine tasks, that there was not really the space to go on doing that. But that might have been only a little bit like personal. I don't want to see it as a symptom or for a crisis of film criticism. It was maybe just sort of like a little bit that personally I was a little bit tired of what I was doing. Still, I have the feeling that it has become more difficult. However, I hope, at least I hope that it's still possible. And something Stefan mentioned when he was juxtaposing popular and cinephilic film criticism, for me it was always a goal to smuggle the more cinephilic pieces of film criticism into the broader context of a newspaper. And I hope that during the time I was there, I succeeded at least partially. And with that, I'm going to conclude.
Thank you very much, Cristina Nord, and Dana Stevens is next.
All right. Well, that worked out well that Cristina ended up talking about the moment that she burned out on film criticism, because I'm in my 11th year right now, so maybe I can look ahead and count down the days to when I'm going to be running an institute of some kind instead. But yes, for now I am, I guess, the working film critic on the panel. And I was asked here by Noah to talk about online film criticism and the state of online film criticism, which, as I started writing down notes about it, I realized is like asking a whale to talk about water, because that is the only form of film criticism I've ever practiced. I started writing for Slate in 2003, I guess the end of 2003, and I came about that job because of a personal film blog I started, like someone else in this room, Farah Neme, who spoke this morning, I believe, about her film blog, in 2002. So again, this is not the 90s. That was in the 90s. I was busy getting that PhD, but it is the very beginning, I think, of people breaking into that career via that mode. And I think, in a way, it was sort of one of the last years, probably, that particular career path could be paved in that way. You know, that just by starting your own unpaid blog, you could eventually sort of wend your way into professional film criticism. And I started writing for Slate, which is the first, I believe, one of the first all-online digital magazines that's still in existence. It began in 1996. I started writing for it in, as I say, 2003, and more or less on film in around 2006. So the changeover from older models of print journalism and print film criticism had already fully happened by the time I had started that job, for better or for worse. And I say for better or for worse because I want to go down a list of some ways that I think online film criticism has changed the field, and for the moment, as I'm first laying them out, to not be too judgy about them. And maybe in the Q&A we can get into, you know, questions of nostalgia. Have things gotten better? Have they gotten worse? You know, what are some of the more promising, uplifting sides of the advent of digital media into film criticism, and what are some of the downsides? But maybe I'll just start off by enumerating what seemed to me like some of the main changes. So, by way of starting this conversation, I was trying to think of some ways in which both producing and consuming film criticism and film writing online has changed in the past, let's say, 20 years or so. I'm taking the beginning of Slate as the beginning of online film criticism here for our purposes. And the first one, which I think is the most obvious one, but which is really important because everything else flows from it, is speed, right? And anybody who, well, I think Stephanie Zaharak would be one of these people, anybody who has written both in the print era and then moved into the digital era can attest to the fact that, you know, the speed with which work has to be produced and circulated, and probably the space of time in which a critic has to think about a film before they have to start, opining on it in print gets shorter and shorter and shorter every year as the digital churn gets faster and faster and faster. So anybody who is writing in digital space knows about and is exhausted by this feature, but maybe also sometimes exhilarated by it, because that conversation that a film starts, it starts happening the minute that film drops, at least the minute that the publicists allow you to get past the embargo and actually say something in public. And often that period of time will be just merely hours that you have to think about a movie before you're suddenly entering that conversation. Number two, related to speed, but something that the internet in its ambivalent wisdom allows, is virality, the passing of links from one person to another, and the way that, a meme can grow. I mean, we've just seen a president get elected by this, this feature of the internet. The way that, a fight can start, a popular opinion can suddenly have a backlash pop against it, right? So speed and virality sort of go hand in hand as the feverish disseminators of information in online criticism, and that also means that criticism becomes less proprietary to the person who wrote it, the publication that published it, or even the region that newspaper comes from, right? It becomes, there starts to be this every place of the internet where ideas are circulating and people grab them and throw them to the next person. And we all live in that world, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, a third feature that also springs from these two is, of course, aggregation. So the sheer volume of critical opinion that's out there now means that, instead of seeking out one critical voice, instead of having your critic that you go to, I think all of us probably still have some of our critics that we trust and we love and we go to hear their opinion, but there are plenty of consumers of film criticism who don't really think about criticism in that way anymore. They go to Rotten Tomatoes or they go to Metacritic. They go to sites where, algorithms are being created to average all of these opinions together into grades and tomato colors and, all different ways of perceiving film quality. And I think to a lot of film critics that is very saddening, because we don't necessarily write a review even knowing if it has a green or a red tomato on it, right? We might be very ambivalent about a film and really struggle to express that ambivalence, and somebody somewhere or some algorithm somewhere is deciding, well, did she like it or did she hate it? Which bucket does it go in, and how do we turn it into this aggregated number? And so that is, I think it has a really huge effect on the production of films themselves, probably. I think that I'm talking here about the consumption of criticism end, but even at the film industry production end, I'm sure that these aggregating sites have an enormous effect on the kind of films that people think want to get made. Okay, another feature would be, of course, democratization, lowering the bar of access to publication. So you can start your own film blog, you can have a Facebook page, you can have a Twitter feed, you can use sites like Letterboxd that allow you to almost create your own body of short film reviews, and you might do that as a professional calling card to try to get a job. You might do it as a personal passion, but it's certainly the case that having an opinion about a film online is no longer the proprietary space of someone who's tied to the authority of an institution, a publication, etc. And obviously this has a double valence. On the upside, everyone has a voice, right? Everyone's a critic, and niche interests can bloom really nicely that way. The internet is great for that. We don't have to just talk about the mainstream studio releases of that week. There can be, a conversation that pops up about Czech animation from the silent days, right? There is there's a space for resuscitation of old films or talking about less mainstream films that wouldn't have existed before the internet. But of course, the downside is that the quality control is sometimes lacking when anybody can say anything, and you start to, not know anymore sort of what is the path that one takes to become a film critic whose opinion has some sort of grounding in film history and can be trusted and listened to. The fourth element I think that the internet introduces into film criticism is coupled with something I said before, is delocalization. So with the separating off of film coverage from local reviewers and the encroachment of this placeless everywhere of the internet I was talking about, writing on film has become less local and regional and more global, which, as we say, could be a good thing in terms of the development of niche interests or people learning about a part of the world, a cinema of the world that they knew nothing about before. But more and more, I think there's once again, there's the chance to read about anything in the history of film, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the chance to see that film, to program that film, you know, that whatever part of the world you're in is going to become a place whose film culture is actually enriched by the internet. Let's see. Oh yes, there's a little corollary to that too. The delocalization, this is a sad corollary, the delocalization has also meant that publications have more power to reduce their full-time writing staffs and to just syndicate a few critical voices across the country, which I think, I mean, is not only a loss of jobs to many people who needed them and really had their own individual voices, but it's a harm to the industry in general, I would say, and that's something that kind of continues apace. And if there's one thing that film critics worry about, I think it's that, you know, we're all going to be slowly mechanized out of a job, and there will just be 4 people's opinions that are being spread everywhere. And there are people in this room, I know, whose jobs and livelihoods have been affected by that feature. And then to end on a maybe more upbeat feature of the internet and film culture is the establishing of online communities that are kind of what I think of as extra-critical or paracritical. I think there's some more talking about that at this conference. Things like, you know, fandom sites and message boards or trailer review sites or places for people to make video essays and mashups and kind of create their own films off of, you know, things that they find online. And this seems to me overall to be a really freeing and exciting development and one to be celebrated, even if it does decrease for writers like me what's sometimes depressingly called eyeballs on our own more traditional kind of discursive style film criticism. So all of these tendencies have something in common. I think certain words that have come up even as I try to describe them to you, like dispersion, dissemination, interactivity, right? That film criticism seems to be becoming ever and ever something less that comes down from on high, from the cahier du cinéma, from somebody who has the authority to speak about an art form, and more something that bubbles up from the ground, right? From the film love, film passion, film fandom that exists in the readership of reviews. So the more people feel that they own film culture in some way and that they can produce it or aggregate it or mash it up or recombine it, the more unstable our role as film critics becomes. But so then this is the question to end on. Is that a productive instability? Is it an instability to be mourned? And what is there to do about it? And that's maybe something to save for the Q&A. I have a much shorter presentation than anyone else because that's sort of the end of my observations, but I had a couple of quotes to read because knowing that this was a conference about Filmkritik in German and about the origin of film criticism in Germany 100 years ago. Incidentally, what is the actual event in 1917 that inspired? Can I ask the organizers that? Why 1917?
Well, just as the 90s seem to stretch into the aughts for you,
right?
The century stretches backwards and forwards for us. The first pieces of criticism date back a full decade before that.
Right.
And in fact,
but 110 years of film criticism just didn't sound the same.
The wonderful anthology that he put together, they anthologized a number of pieces from as far back. The earliest you ever, I think, are from 1907, is that right? Yeah. So.
It sounds much better if you ask for money than you say a century.
Century was very elegant, we thought.
What's the better hashtag?
Yeah, right, yeah.
110 years sounds like you just weren't on the ball enough to get it together at 100 years.
But the 90s are also a very long decade, so it works out in the end.
Well, so I thought I would read a little quote from a German film critic, since we're going German in this conference, and I came across it in this wonderful book, which a lot of you probably know, American Movie Critics, an anthology from the silence until now. It's just a great anthology edited by Philip Lopate that just syncretizes kind of the history of American film criticism, and not just American, because this is Rudolf Arnheim I'm about to read from, although it was after he emigrated from Germany. And I thought it was particularly apropos because it's called The Film Critic of Tomorrow, which I guess the online film critic is now. And he was also writing at a moment, this is written in 1935, when he perceived something that a lot of hand-wringers and naysayers perceive right now, that that cinema was at this turning point, that it had been turned hopelessly into a commodity and there was no looking back. He really regarded the end of silent film as kind of the end of film as a high art. So I have a couple things to read about that, and then maybe we can discuss later on whether, you know, this somewhat apocalyptic tone is something that critics should be thinking or worrying about now. Really quickly, I'm just going to read 3 rules that he lays out, that Arnheim lays out in this little essay, The Film Critic of Tomorrow, so you can get a sense of how doomy and gloomy he was in the early days of sound about the state of cinema. So he says, first rule, the talking film as a means of representation precludes artistic creation. Second rule, the film is manufactured as a commodity so that it can be sold as easily as possible. We can pretty much identify with that still these days. Third rule, the film is not so much the expression of individual opinions as it is the expression of general political and moral views. So he's taking the position of, I mean, I guess you'd say a vaguely Marxist critic here, right? He wants to look at film as a product of culture and not as a kind of individual psychological art form. In fact, he, at another point, is very down on critics who talk about Joan Crawford's psychological subtleties. He's not interested in Crawford analysis. But then here's the... But so then here's just a slightly longer and great little hand-wringy paragraph that he has about the future of film criticism. One of the tasks of the film critic of tomorrow, perhaps he will even be called a television critic, will be to rid the world of the comic figure the average film critic and film theorist of today represents. He lives from the glory of his memories like the 70-year-old ex-court actresses, rummages about as they do in yellowing photographs, speaks of names that are long gone. He discusses films no one has been able to see for 10 years or more, and about which they can therefore say anything and everything. Or rather, I'm sorry, about which they can therefore say everything and nothing, with people of his own ilk. He argues about montage like medieval scholars discuss the existence of God, believing all these things could still exist today. In the evening, he sits with rapt attention in the cinema, a critical art lover, as though we still lived in the days of Griffith, Stroheim, Murnau, and Eisenstein. He thinks he is seeing bad films instead of understanding that what he sees is no longer film at all. Yeah. So maybe Words for the Ages, I'm not sure. I do really recommend that essay by Rudolf Arnheim. And maybe we can discuss, yeah, some of these open moral questions about the internet, good or evil, in the Q&A. Thank you.
And on that happy note, thank you. I'd like to turn it over to Fatima Naqvi.
Thank you. I'm the last one today, and I know I stand between you and dinner. But I do want to take this last opportunity to thank both Noah and Geert. And I was going to thank Geert for having me come back to Dartmouth after all these years by giving a talk that said basically that film critique and film criticism, understood as the academic study of film, had nothing to do with each other. But then I thought that might be too rude. But I did think about it originally, you know, are film critique, so what we would read in venues such as these, irrespective of whether we read them print or digitally, and what we do as film criticism in the academy, whether these two words, film critique and film criticism, are actually false friends, or what linguists would call false friends, that they don't necessarily mean the same thing in both contexts. I mean, as film critics, or as film critique focuses on a mass medium in publication venues dependent on a mass readership, the film criticism emanating from the ivory tower engages with this mass medium, largely untouched by any kind of financial considerations. At stake is also a different kind of expertise, right? That the film critica is somebody who would be doing a kind of synchronic slice through time, connecting the dots, I think, as Dennis Lim said before. And the film critic of the academy would be somebody who would be interested in a more kind of vertical, historical duration, a kind of diachrony across time. But this opposition between film critique and film criticism is, like most binary oppositions, a false one. And I would like to argue, or at least test the hypothesis with you today, that film critique in certain kinds of cases can become the condition for the possibility of the creation of an academic field. So in the area in which I am most interested, so works coming from or about Austria understood in the widest sense of the term, films by people like Michael Haneke, Ulrich Seidel, Michi Glavoga, Nikolaus Geierhalter, Jessica Hausner, Barbara Albert, I think one could make the argument that Filmkritik becomes the condition for the possibility of this new academic field, and that Filmkritik constitutes the discursive field for academic film criticism of the kind that some of us in this room do. In the writings by film historians and scholars on film critique, there is a plethora of negativism, and we've heard some of it here today, and that seems to stand in a kind of opposition to this grandiose claim that I've just staked for film critique. So we hear all about the anxiety of authority, the permanent crisis mode of Filmkritik, the constraints of ekphrasis, and the dangers of translating from image to word, from sound to letter, and this uncertain status of the good object, which may turn out to be a bad object after all. So there's often also this strangely confessional tone. So scholars and historians and critics like Klaus Kreimeier or Thomas Elsässer begin their reflections on Filmkritik with anecdotes about their own beginnings when they wrote reviews from a certain politicized perspective. And I'm tempted to say that this combination of pessimism and confessionalism in these writings generally arises from an unspoken discomfort. So in an egalitarian age, the basic divisions that film criticism or film critique must undertake, labeling as something worth seeing or not, so giving something the predicat sehenswert or not, makes many people feel uncomfortable. And this confessional mode serves to offer a kind of justification in such a hazardous undertaking as canon formation, because that's in the end what this is about. So youthful folly, generational idealism, unacknowledged cinephilia, or more prosaically and most often penury is given as a kind of justification for having been engaged in film critique at all. So this gatekeeper function that makes people uncomfortable is, of course, nothing new. And it's like the crisis of film criticism or film critique that has this endless regress. Every time you think you found the origin, you can go back in time and you find even more. It's the same with this gatekeeper function of the critic. And it's been the stuff of endless reflection, actually, in the post-war period, when writers such as Ingeborg Bachmann speak at length about the role of the critic, who, according to Bachmann, leave untouched the true questions of art with their, quote, all too smooth translations into the language of literary problems. These were her words from 1959-1960 for her Frankfurt poetology lectures. But these judgments of the art critic come in for vicious satire 25 years later with Thomas Bernhard and his novel Old Masters, where the professional critic is described as the, quote, vilest trade there is. The protagonist protagonist in this wonderful novel attacks all twaddling art historians because there are only twaddling art historians, and these deserve to be chased out with a whip, chased out of the world of art, as the obstreperous protagonist of this novel, a music critic for the Times of London, tells his listener as he tries to instruct him in a non-gatekeeping function and in a kind of anti-canon formation. So the protagonist in this novel seems to demand the impossible from criticism, be it academic or non-academic. He's to circumvent the role of the gatekeeper altogether. He's never to be garrulous, only, quote, a modest enlightener and reporter who leaves the work of art open to the beholder, who does not close it for him with his twaddling. And it's much better in German. Nicholas Mahler, the graphic novelist, returns to this 25 years later. Obviously, this reflection on gatekeeping and canon formation is something that doesn't let people go. And in his retake on Bernhard's scenario, if anything, the critic has become more dominant in his pronouncements, the ultimate vanishing point of the works of art. And here we see the critic framed by the doorway, his listener and acolyte watching him from the outside, and the critic pronouncing in these large speech bubbles on what it is that art may or may not be. And in a kind of feedback loop, the critic then takes the center stage in the very field he has helped constitute. So the work of art is actually disappeared by the critic's pronouncements, and all that is left are his words. So I haven't seen the film, and this continues into the present, I haven't seen the film Wilde Maus by Josef Hader, where we again have a music critic in the center of the film, film from last year. So I'm tempted to say that the animus behind the denigration of the critic lies with the fact that, as François Truffaut said, that no artist can reconcile himself with the function of the critic. And one might think in this context that it's not only an Austrian phenomenon. In 2002, Martin Walser wrote a rather problematic novel called The Death of the Critic, where he also focused on a very important cultural figure in the German field. The function of the critic in a small field, so such as that of post-war Austrian culture, is one in which the critic's work is constitutive of the very field that he surveys. And in the early 90s, of interest for our purposes today, critics such as Michael Omaster, Bert Rebhandl, Klaus Philipp, Stefan Grissemann, who's with us, Konstantin Wolf, Christian Carnelli, Isabella Reicher, Birgit Floß, Robert Buchschwenter, to name just a few, devoted their time and energy to works by Austrian directors in venues such as the weekly Falter, the daily newspaper Der Standard, Austrian Public Broadcasting, and EPD Film. The newly founded journal Meteor, on which I'll focus now, carrying the clever subtitle Text to accompany the moving image, so Texte zum Laufbild, added its own imprimatur to the lively discussion about film in general and Austrian film until its demise after the issue number 15. 2 years after its founding, the influential German weekly Die Zeit lamented that this magazine was far too little known. And in a special issue in 1998 on Austrian film, attention was paid to everything from film festivals to the relationship between public broadcasting and the commissioning of film to new short films and the problem with Michael Haneke. So all problems that remain with us today. Meteor's table of contents show a wide diversity of subjects and crossover with an incredibly interdisciplinary approach. The journal offered a forum for translations of important works such as Tom Gunning's essay on the cinema of attractions, essays by Harun Farocki, Godard, Peter Bogdanovich, etc. It allotted space to writers such as Salman Rushdie, Marlene Strerowitz, Elfriede Jelinek, and Friederike Mayröcker. And these are particularly spectacular examples of film criticism. Writing on Xaver Schwarzenberger's La Moite from 1996, for instance, Strerowitz begins macrocosmically before ending microscopically with this particular film. And so just I'm going to do a little kind of collation of 2 slides here, just in English. Filmmaking is more than all other forms of expression life-giving. I think this life-giving is the reason why there's so much dying in films, why in especially trivial forms of film, a dramaturgic death always is foregrounded, pushes itself into the foreground. So these reflections in and of themselves deserve an article. In Strerowitz's essay, she also finds very succinct poetic descriptions about the particular problems with the TV serial-inspired episodic narrative. Im Medium findet die endgültige Entpolitisierung der weiblichen Existenz ihre endgültige Vollendung. In the medium, the final depoliticization of feminine existence finds its final realization. Elfriede Jelinek, who won a Nobel Prize a few years onward, reflected on the relationship between sport, control society, self-discipline, and the media, and brings together reflections on Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator and stardom. Friederike Mayröcker's poetic hallucinations to Ottmar Schmiederer's film Am Steiner function as an expansion and supplement to the film itself. In all of these cases, the journal made very clear the works constituted by criticism are not simply the object of cursory interest, but springboards into another way of looking at the world where contemplation, interest, sensuousness, sensibility, a political stance are not mutually exclusive terms. Appearing at the same time and with an expanded cast of contributors, so many of the people who did contribute to Meteor were also in these books that I'm going to mention. 3 films in the Edition Wespennest from 1993, 1995, and 1996, respectively, outlined a newly constituted field of Austrian film studies at the very moment that Austria acceded to the EU in 1995, so no simple kind of national framework. Next to Aufbruch ins Ungewisse, Departure into the Uncertain, about exilic filmmakers and avant-garde Austria, about the post-war experimental film scene. The new Austrian film, Der Neue Österreichische Film, edited by Gottfried Schlemmer, was the capstone in the simultaneous constitution of a field that university film studies will spend the next 20 years exploring. And I should add that 3 Austrian studies by Alexander Horvath and Michael Omastos, Der Siebente Kontinent, on Michael Haneke and his films, Stefan Grissemann's film on Ulrich Seidel that was already mentioned, Der Sündenfall, and a recent film, Alejandro Bachmann's Spaces in Time, Räume in der Zeit, on Nikolaus Geierhalter, have preceded any academic book-length studies. In the Hansel film edition, which came out in conjunction with the daily newspaper Der Standard, they bring to the DVD now, it's a sum total of 280 DVDs, a recent kind of best of Austrian cinema. I mean, 280 films is a lot of films, so the best of might not be the operative term anymore. In these DVD editions, and I'm sorry if the scanner was only black and white, you have the DVD performing a kind of interesting function. On the inner flap, you have a historic review of a film, and on another flap, you have the liner essay written by a contemporary critic, often one of the people that I've mentioned in the course. I'm almost done, in the course of my talk. So these are they are in color, and these are an interesting kind of suture that these DVDs perform, a kind of flash, perhaps, in the Benjaminian sense, making us aware of 2 different moments in the reception of the film, the moment when this DVD is brought to the market and the moment in which this film actually had been released. So it's a kind of first aid kit for the distance disabled like myself, who only get these films sent across the ocean, or for the ethically and aesthetically perplexed, as my graduate students sometimes are when they first view these films. In closing, let me look for a kind of allegory in film on the role of the critic and canon formation. There might be no better place to look than in Michael Haneke himself, whose film Cachet is a film about a kind of an artist's revenge on these gatekeepers of the discipline. In his film from 2005 on the repercussions of traumatic memory and the inability to mourn, the central figure is this literary critic for television, one of those very gatekeepers that I've been discussing. He and his wife, who works for a publisher, are continually engaged in a kind of promotional jockeying for a book or a show about books. The film presents him both as a guardian to a fortress-like domicile, both archive of the books he reads and the archive of his repressed secrets. He's often presented at the gates or at the main door to his home, trying to guard against unwanted intruders, opening or slamming the door, as the case may be, and the images are unfortunately a little bit dark. We see him engaged in one scene editing a talk show after the fact. He can cut out what he likes or doesn't like, reducing complexity or adding narrative tension as you may want to read it. This seems to me the ultimate artist's fantasy, the moment when the critic and the artist are collapsed in one person, reconciling the creator with the person who will judge in a mass-mediated forum. However, efforts to keep the outside in this film are always require this massive amount of effort, and in image after image, the film repeats the horizontals of the home's bookshelves across exterior walls, swimming pools, staircases, and the workplace itself. So the inside is always already outside and vice versa. The movement into deep space becomes at the same time a movement into flat space. We're always being brought back to the TV screen, which can be edited. Ultimately, the gatekeeper function in this film is maintained, the exterior is kept in check, and only the desired elements are allowed to enter. So the show, in this case, continues. The literary critic on television maintains his function. So Haneke, who in his professional life actually began as a critic, he wrote a review of Thomas Bernhard, with whom I began, is very acutely aware that this uneasy friendship in a small friend can turn out to be what Austrians call a Freundelwirtschaft, a close and almost too close and claustrophobic constellation which doesn't let in other voices. And it's to the credit of all these filmmakers that I've been discussing that they have never produced the sense of a small elite unwilling to engage other opinions, or this idea of a kind of claustrophobic, catastrophic claustrophobia. And their work has accompanied the rise of these great films from a small land, to borrow the title and paraphrase the title of a work in progress by the film critic Karin Schiefer and the photographer and filmmaker Lukas Beck. And sometimes I wonder whether the complexity and the beauty of the film critique that I've been describing becomes a condition for the possibility of better films when the people engaged in making these films are also engaged in a dialogue with the people they know will watch them and write about them. But that question actually remains for a different time and place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatima Naqvi. Thank you to all of our speakers also for sticking to our slam format. And now I'd like to turn it over to the audience, and I look forward to your questions.
For Cristina Nord, thank you for all four of you, but for Cristina Nord, so what is your take about female pleasure in Tarantino?
It's a very complicated. It's a very complicated question, and I think I refer to Death Proof because I found it highly interesting. It's two-folded. There's sort of like one version of the story, and then there's another version of the story, and the male version of the story is at the beginning, and then the female version of the story sort of like X's out the male version. And for that reason, I think he's very much prone to celebrating female pleasure. But at the same time, I had the feeling that he's very conscious about the ambivalence of exploitation film and female pleasure, because usually it's about male pleasure, and sometimes very violently so. Most of the times very violently so. And for me, being a film critic, for instance, that was always something which was at stake when I was talking to colleagues who were very much into genre and exploitation film, and there are quite a lot of them. Because I had the feeling that my position, in a way, had to be different. I couldn't simply cling to even classics like Argento's film Suspiria. For me, it was hard. It was really hard to watch Suspiria because I found it very hostile towards towards women, and so I had the feeling that I was sort of like in a double position. On the one hand, enjoying certain aesthetic choices, a certain B-movie richness, and at the same time wondering, where's my position as a spectator? And I don't want to talk about this in a very essentialistic manner, like me being a woman, I have to like per se and forever, and it's not that. So I find this a very difficult question, and I had the feeling that that Tarantino tackles it in Death Proof mainly, but also in other films. On the other hand, it's always, I think there's always something ambivalent about Tarantino. So in a way, he's very complex and very self-reflective. And on the other hand, he simply celebrates whatever pleasure there can be. And that can be pretty violent and hard to watch.
Go ahead. earlier today we heard from Claudia Lenz, and you spoke of a screening of the lives of others, das Leben der anderen, and they would only agree upon it if there was a certain critic from Munich who was brought in who was known to love the film. And I'm curious whether within this sort of the age of the internet and these sort of fandom sites, because there's something that Dana spoke about that is on the one hand exciting and liberating and democratizing and so forth, but on the other hand, does it also then give license to these same sorts of PR agents and marketing people to find those very fans and use them as surrogates for marketing a film? I'm just curious about this relationship between art and commerce as we get deeper and deeper into the 21st century, and how much power is now ceded to those press agents and PR people, whether that has increased with time. There have been a number of presentations over the course of today that have at least intimated at that, and whether it's in the festivals, and I think Dennis, I think you spoke about this as well. If you've got a very, very powerful press agent, then your film may be more likely to be screened, which makes a great deal of sense. But I'm curious as well in terms of the kinds of criticism that was developed in the 1990s, whether that too we're beginning to get awfully close between, sort of basically narrowing the gap between art and commerce, is whether it's always been uncomfortably cozy. I'm not sure. I'd love to hear people speak about it. And that anecdote really kind of stuck with me. There was another one that you mentioned as well. I think it was Til Schweiger. They wouldn't allow these press screenings as well. And so, I mean, we've had a couple of these over the course of the day. But I turn it over to the panel maybe to respond.
I mean, I can start. I think Cristina would be great on that too, and I'd love to hear how it works differently in Europe, if at all. I mean, I'm sure a case could be made that there was never much of a distinction between, or never as crisp of a distinction as we might want between the PR arm of, the entertainment industry and film criticism, and certainly even in this Lopate collection of film criticism, he sort of watches the way that independent voices in film criticism emerge from this early soup that was sort of this mixture of, vaudeville write-ups and, plot descriptions and things that were supplied by PR representatives, and that slowly something like an independent critical voice emerged. But I think there's always been that dark area. The problem maybe with the internet, and not just the internet, but the increasing sophistication of film marketing machines, is that distinction gets harder and harder to draw. You may know as a writing critic, like, I'm independent, I'm not bought out, I'm giving my opinion of whatever this film is, but in the very way that it was presented to you, or whether or not it was presented to you, or who got to see it when, and who got to write on it when, there could be manipulation going on. And it certainly happened to me in the past, from movies on a much lower rung. Like, I remember one of the G.I. Joe movies that I was supposed to review for my magazine, and they wouldn't show it to me, because of the outlet that I wrote for, I suppose. But, it was one of those things that was being shown to bloggers and fanboys and people that were going to give it some sort of ravey thumbs-up blurb, rather than actually showing it to anyone who might say anything negative about it. And so I and a few other critics who were shut out of that screening decided, G.I. Joe no more. We're not going to weigh in on any of these movies in the future. Okay, that is maybe, at such a low end of quality that we don't particularly care whether we get an independent critical voice on G.I. Joe. But I think that kind of manipulation of who sees what when is something that's getting more and more sophisticated and trickier to get around. And I know for me, I don't know what are some of the things that made Cristina feel like she was just done being a day-to-day, week-to-week film critic. But one of the things that makes me feel that way is whenever I start to get the sense that I'm an arm of the entertainment industry, or that someone's trying to use me in that way. I never feel my publication's trying to use me in that way. But, any moment that I start to feel, wait a second, this junket invitation or whatever this thing is some attempt to get me on board with, just being a wingman for your movie, then, no, then it starts to lose all its interest. I don't know. Cristina, do you have
I would add to that, the specific moment you were talking about, Claudia, there was a critic who had written a negative review of the film, Klaus Lürzer, who was disinvited to the event. In a way, what von Donnersmarck did was to really try to set up conditions under which his film could only be understood in a very positive way. He used the phrase, he wanted everyone to like this film. He wanted to make a film, and he didn't want anyone not to like it. And in a sense, this was a way of choreographing that fantasy. He's also someone who wanted to really manipulate the conditions under which this film could be understood. It was invited to the Berlinale, but only in the panorama. And he said, no, ich will nicht zu den Schwulis gehen. I don't want to be among the homos, right? And I think this is part of this larger discursive construction that I think became very clear in the Rohrbach essay, where critics were essentially pathologized as autistic, right? And in a sense, critical critics, then critics who somehow did not allow themselves to be somehow, let us say, bowled over by these big production films, somehow were essentially being marginalized, but in a very concerted way.
I would say that the conditions have worsened in the course of the years while I was working there. And for me, it was especially with interviews that I would not get access to interviews, and we had the policy to publish one-on-one interviews exclusively. I mean, like not exclusive interviews, but one-on-one interviews. And Die Tageszeitung is a small newspaper, and I mean, everything coming from Hollywood was out of the question. I think once I had the chance to talk to Wes Anderson, but apart from that, Greta Gerwig maybe, but apart from that, it was really difficult. And for instance, at Cannes, it was nearly impossible to get interviews. So that was one thing. The other thing was like all this privacy invasion before press screenings, when you attend sort of like the press screening of a major production, which I felt very tiresome after a while. Like you get searched. I mean, not like at an airport, but nearly like that. You have to leave your mobile phones and stuff, and there are people with night vision devices to control that you're not filming the film with your mobile device. I mean, who's doing this? It's absurd, but and they have this laser things, and they point at you haphazardly, and it's really absurd. And of course, I remember the Rohrbach text in Der Spiegel, but I also remember, it's not only the big guys. I also remember when I started, like after a year or 2 years, a distribution company for art house films wrote a letter of complaint to the head of the arts department at Die Tageszeitung, and they complained because I would destroy all the films they released, all of them, and I would do it on purpose, and because I had very, very bad intentions, and I think they had an example. It was like one of Ken Loach's films, and it was really sort of like they had the idea that Taz, Die Tageszeitung, being left-leaning, had to like and rave about Ken Loach's film. And they were flabbergasted because it was not the case. And they complained sort of like at a higher level, and it didn't improve the working relation, to put it mildly. So it's not only major studios and the PR agents of major studios who try to influence your work. It's also smaller distribution companies, especially when you're working at a newspaper which has a certain importance for these smaller companies and venues.
It's just a quick thing. Eric, could you repeat the translation of what von Donnersmarck said when they told me he was playing the panorama?
I don't want to be invited to the section of the festival that is known for showing homosexual films.
How does nobody know about this?
If you go to the Berlinale, you surely know about it. I know people working at the Berlinale. he was invited. You know, he wanted to be in the main competition, and because he only got this kind of secondary invitation, he was infuriated. No, that story made the rounds in the Berlinale office. Why it wasn't written about, anyone's guess. It's a good story.
It's a terrifying story in a way. That film is beloved by hundreds of Americans who I'm sure didn't hear that. That's very, very discouraging.
Even without that quote, they should know it's an awful film.
Hi, I have a sort of a follow-up question, if anyone can take this on, and it's following up on Jim's talk. Would anybody want to take on just explaining Fassbinder's reception at the time, either in Germany or Austria?
That's a huge subject. That's sort of like another conference, and then another conference, and then another one, I'd say. Yeah.
But how much does it match what Jim was saying about New York?
It's difficult to say because there are so many layers to it. There was, for instance, in the 70s, when he published a theater piece that was reproached of being anti-Semitic, and the notion of left-wing anti-Semitism was coined. And I don't want to go into detail. It was a very, very complicated discussion, which tainted the reputation of Fassbinder. There was constantly a discussion about his sexuality, and that would be used in order to disqualify his films. When Berlin Alexanderplatz was released in television, a lot of people complained that it was too dark, that there was not enough light. And if you happen to have seen the DVD edition, you can clearly see that it was sort of like made a little bit brighter. And that where in the original it was blackish, in the DVD version it's more like brownish, and it has a golden shimmer. So yeah, that was something. There was when he the television series 8 Hours Are Not a Day, which was shown at the Berlinale this year, was broadcasted, I think, in 72 or 73, and there was discussion about it because he would have wanted to do more, another season, and it was not approved by Rohrbach, by the way. And so it was he was received. I mean, of course, films like Die Ehe der Maria Braun were very, very highly praised and widely acclaimed. But on the other hand, there was constant debate and discussion about him.
One general thing one can say about the Fassbinder reception in Germany, that it was very much influenced by the reception abroad, not just the United States, but France and other countries. And really, a recognition was bestowed upon him and some of his contemporaries only after they had scored festival hits and so in other countries. Alex, that's the final question goes to you, and then we'll wrap up.
I don't want to take much time off because you answered it already, I guess, in a way, but while these controversies that Cristina spoke about are of course true, it was almost always controversial, and the French reception did play a role. I think it's important to also realize that around the mid to late 70s, Fassbinder was probably the central cultural figure in German arts discourse. Because of the controversy, I don't know, but some of the films were extremely widely seen and had millions of spectators, and because he was active in theater, in other art forms as well, so it should not, the image we received, I mean, what I'm trying to say is we should not believe that the New York film world saved Fassbinder from extinction in the imagination of Germans. That would not be a correct way to see it. So he was absolutely central cultural figure.
Yeah, but I mean, I do have to say that the very positive reception, not only of Fassbinder, but of the new German filmmakers in general abroad, became something of an enabling act. That they were, you know, these were alternative filmmakers. These were, in a sense, anti-establishment forces. These were formally very demanding figures. And of course, the notion of being outré was absolutely essential for their public profile. But I think beyond that, there is a way in which being recognized abroad and being thought of so well, not only in New York, but in London and in France, there was a way in which you could triangulate desire, that you could be somehow besieged at home, and Fassbinder was constantly besieged. That the Krisengeschichte is part of the Fassbinder phenomenon, and I think that recognition abroad really became that important moment that sort of would crystallize ultimately the new German cinema, and actually towards the end of the 70s make the new German cinema once the Social Democrats take power again, the new German cinema becomes, through the Goethe Institutes, a form of cultural ambassador to sell the good Germany, the critical Germany, abroad.
Many thanks. I think we unfortunately have to stop the discussion here.